In this knowing, then, spirit has concluded the movement in which it has shaped itself, insofar as this shaping was burdened with the difference of consciousness, that is, of the latter from its object, a difference now overcome. Spirit has won the pure element of its existence, the notion. The content, in accordance with the freedom of its being, is the self-alienating self, or the immediate unity of self-knowledge. The pure movement of this alienation, considered in connection with the content, constitutes the necessity of the content. The distinct content as determinate is in relation, is not in itself. It is its own restless process of superseding itself, or negativity. Therefore, negativity or diversity, like free being, is also the self. And in this self-like form, in which existence is immediately thought, the content is the notion. Spirit, therefore, having won the notion, displays its existence and movement in this ether of its life and is science. In this, the moments of its movement no longer exhibit themselves as specific shapes of consciousness, but since consciousness's difference has returned into the self, as specific notions and as their organic self-grounded movement. Whereas in the Phenomenology of Spirit, each moment is the difference of knowledge and truth and is the movement in which that difference is canceled, science, on the other hand, does not contain this difference and the canceling of it. On the contrary, since the moment has the form of the notion, it unites the objective form of truth and of the knowing self in an immediate unity. The moment does not appear as this movement of passing back and forth from consciousness or picture thinking into self-consciousness, and conversely, on the contrary, its pure shape, freed from its appearance in consciousness, the pure notion and its onward movement, depends solely on its pure determinateness. Conversely, to each abstract moment of science corresponds a shape of manifest spirit as such. Just as spirit in its existence is not richer than science, so too it is not poorer either in content. To know the pure notions of science in this form of shapes of consciousness constitutes the side of their reality, in accordance with which their essence, the notion which is posited in them in its simple mediation as thinking, breaks asunder the moments of this mediation and exhibits itself in accordance with the inner antithesis. In paragraph 805, we get another really important transition point, and as Hegel's going to say, sort of correspondence between two of the things that we're particularly interested in Hegelian philosophy. And one of them is knowing, or knowledge, if you want to take a more substantive, the Wissen, right? So the knowing of who? Of spirit, but also of consciousness, self-consciousness. The phenomenologist who's been studying along with Hegel, these many different transformations going on. And then science, Wissenschaft, not a term that's radically new at this point, but we're getting a much better understanding of what it means in relation to, and he names the text here, the phenomenology of spirit, right? So we're going to get a correspondence between what is happening abstractly in science, Wissenschaft, and what we have traversed in this entire book in terms of shapes of consciousness, Gestalten des Bewusstsein, or in this case, shapes of spirit, because spirit has been using and inhabiting these shapes to come to understand itself through us, through human beings, in this entire process of development. So we're looking at how spirit's knowing transforms, or better said, reveals itself as also being science, as Wissenschaft, at this final stage. And I do want to point out one other thing before we jump into the text, something that's coming up about, I would say, 2/3 of the way through this. He talks about this also being a shape of consciousness, right? So, absolute knowing is itself one of the shapes, but it's a different shape. It's a final shape, at least as far as this text goes. We could talk about its location in Hegel's larger project. So how does this fit in with the science of logic? Well, that's a much bigger discussion that has vexed many Hegel scholars and interpreters throughout the years, maybe even bothered Hegel a little bit for all we know, right? So let's take a look at what's actually here in this very interesting paragraph. So he says, in this knowing, spirit has concluded, it's brought to a finish, the movement in which it has shaped itself. Now, movement in which it's shaped itself, Hegel actually uses the term Gestalt in there, and not just as a verb, but actually as a noun. It's shaped itself in time, space, history. And then he says, insofar as this shaping was burdened with the difference, the Unterschied, distinction, of consciousness. And then here Miller offers a gloss of consciousness from its object. And that kind of makes sense. I'm not super happy with giving that gloss, in part because it makes it a little bit restrictive. What is the distinction? Yes, consciousness is distinguished from its object. It's also as self-consciousness distinguished from itself, as we're going to see in just a moment, and from other self-consciousnesses. So, maybe do we want to consider those its object? I don't think that really works here. But he says this is a difference that is now overcome. And over again in this, Hegel is going to be talking about how this distinction, this difference is aufgehoben, right? How it's being sublated, canceled, overcome, however you want to describe it. And this is going to get a little bit more clear as we go on. So he says, spirit has won the pure element of its existence, its Dasein, the notion, the concept, the Begriff. This is what we've been seeking the entire time. And we've had all sorts of notions along the way, to be sure, but we've got to distinguish between, let's call them lowercase n notions or lowercase c concepts, which are not finished, not completely worked through, and might actually be given to us not through thought or the concept itself, but through other modes of thinking, acting, feeling, those sorts of things, lesser modes in Hegel's point of view. Think about the religion section. We were encountering the concept, but we were doing so in part through the mediation of the community, which is good, and through the image and through thinking about our own relation to it in the cult, the worship, and through representation or picture thinking, Vorstellung, right? Now we're getting beyond that. Not in the sense that we've all left it behind. And imagine, just for a little bit of a digression here, imagine a book that's filled with all sorts of pictures and diagrams and schemas and stuff like that. And does aufheben mean tearing all that out and replacing it with stuff up in our head? No, you leave the book there, but now you've extracted from it what the fuller meaning, its sense is, and you understand your own relationship to it, and you understand the limited adequacy of the pictures within it. And we could say the same thing for language too, right? Which is a much more flexible medium than the visible signs and diagrams and schemas and that sort of thing. Even language has its limits, but we can overcome them and incorporate that. And we don't throw it away. We don't say, well, a verbal formula, no good, get rid of it. We don't like definitions. But we understand how and why they aren't the full picture, if we want to use a little pun here, right? So he goes on and he says, the content, in accordance with the freedom, Freiheit, of its being, sein, is what? The self-alienating self, right? The sich entäußerende Selbst. And so the self that isn't just alienating, but is going outside of itself, out into, this is where we can talk about the self and its objects that it's grasping through its consciousness, right? Or grasping itself by looking at itself from the outside, self-consciousness, grasping itself in relation to other self-consciousnesses, perhaps even grasping itself in terms of larger societal, cultural movements that it is a part of, right? So this is all included, we could say, in the self-alienating self, that is the content. And then we've got this thing, movement, Bewegung, right? So he says the self-alienating self, or the immediate unity of self-knowledge, knowledge of itself, right? I am a self. I know myself. Do I know myself perfectly? No. As a matter of fact, I may need the mediation of somebody else, a friend, counselor, role model, therapist, pick whoever else you want to help me more fully understand what it is that I am as a self. And then he goes on and he says, the pure movement of this alienation, so the movement involved in this going outside of the self, becoming other to the self, considered in connection with the content, right? So in a way, the content itself is not just content, because as we look at the content, it not only has this self-alienating thing that we go, oh, that's really cool, but it's also got the movement itself of that, which is kind of the content, kind of not the content, right? And he says the pure movement of this alienation, considered in connection with the content, constitutes the necessity, the Notwendigkeit, the why it has to be the way it is, the intelligibility for us as well of this content. And now he says something really interesting. The rest is interesting, but this I find really, really interesting. The distinct content, right, the content of what spirit is, as determinate, right? So as not just any old abstract content, but as something that is. We go back to existence, right? Is in relation, right? Is not in itself. So this is not in itself, something that is just what it is and nothing more. It's in relation to other things. In relation to what? Well, that's what we would expect to see, in relation to this, in relation to that. And Hegel kind of leaves that open. And I think what we ought to do here is interpret that as, this is an important moment where we realize that the content exists not by itself, but as what it is through its relations to other contents, right, in spirit. Because he goes on and he says, it is its own restless process. Now, restless process, unrest is a better way of translating it. It is this Unruhe, this not staying still, of what? This restlessness, this not remaining the same thing. And he says it's supersession of itself, aufheben. So that's where we get this coming in. And then he talks about, therefore, negativity or diversity, like free being, which we just mentioned, is also the self. So the self is all these things. Negativity, self-alienating self by its very nature, right? Not in itself, in relation, all of superseding itself. These are all involved at this stage in what it means to be a self at this point in the development of spirit. Is he saying this about every single self? No, unfortunately. As we know, for Hegel, the dialectical process leaves an awful lot of selves behind at earlier stages, earlier shapes of consciousness in the dialectic, and may not even extend to all in the present of his own time or in our time as well. There's a tragic element to Hegel's view on history and human beings. A little bit of a side note there. All right, coming back to this. So he says, negativity, diversity, free being, in this self-like form in which existence is immediately thought. Now, immediately thought not in the sense of we immediately think of existence. Existence is Dasein, thought is Gedanke, Denken. And so we've got these two put together as a sort of an identity statement, right? Existence is thought at this point. So we're not engaging in a lot of action. That's kind of behind us at this point. So he goes on and says, here we go, in this self-like form in which existence is immediately thought, the content is the notion. So the Begriff. This is what, one understanding of the notion we've been seeking this entire time is. And then he goes on and we get this important transition. Spirit, therefore having won the notion, attained to the notion, displays its existence and movement in this ether of its life and is science, Wissenschaft. Now, there's a word here that we need to explain a little bit and to clarify the implications of. So what is ether? You may think of ether as a quaint word for gas that might get used for its anesthetic properties. And that's a later term. Originally, ether is a fifth element, a quintessence, right? In addition to air, earth, fire, water in the Greek thing, sometimes they postulated that. And it could be the medium or the basis of thought or of the fiery stars above or whatever you want, right? It was always conjectural. And by the time of Hegel's writing, ether now is something that is being sort of thought of as a medium for possibly carrying things. So it's not just an imaginary notion or concept at the time of Hegel. It means something like a medium. And so it displays, the spirit displays its existence, its Dasein, and its movement, its Bewegung, in this ether, this medium of its life, and is, because of all of this, science. So he tells us in what? In science, the moments of its movement no longer exhibit themselves as specific shapes of consciousness, as they were for spirit in this entire book, but since consciousness's difference has returned into the self over here, right? They are displayed as specific notions. So, specific, determinate, bestimmte Begriffe. Later on, he's going to talk about pure notions. This is how science works. The notions are the content and the thing we move between for science. So this is good if you want to go on to the science of logic, or think about some of his other discussions as well that come about later. So anyway, back to this. As specific notions, but also as something else. They're organic, self-grounded movement. So it's not a purely static, schematic sort of, think about the old caricature of Hegel that he does sometimes give a little bit of fuel for by loving to do things in terms of triads. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And then the synthesis becomes a new thesis for a new antithesis and synthesis. This is the way many people have misrepresented Hegel's thought. And not just Hegel's thought, but Hegel's thinking about thought and its development. It doesn't work quite like that, right? There is movement. There is, in fact, contradiction. We're actually going to end with Gegensatz at the end of this paragraph. which is being translated here as antithesis rather than contradiction. But things aren't quite so neat and simple, are they? Never really in Hegel, or really in any important thinker for that matter. All right, back to the text. So he says, whereas in the Phenomenology of Spirit, and here he's naming it, Phenomenologie des Geistes, right? Whereas in the Phenomenology of Spirit, each moment is a difference of knowledge and truth, of Wissen and Wahrheit, right? So they don't quite match up, right? There is a distinction between them. And we can say, well, what is truth? For Hegel, truth, Wahrheit, is not just correspondence of what's in our mind and our language with reality. It's how things actually hold together. And we could actually go on further and say, because that's often talked about as the coherence theory of truth as opposed to the correspondence theory of truth. We could say that Hegel's understanding of truth is a bit more robust than a mere coherence theory of truth. It's not just that everything hangs together in a totality and makes sense with each other. Everything has to be worked through its contradictions so that they can actually hold together and not be entirely separate things that we can concentrate on this one or this one, but not both at the same time. So going on, right? He says, each moment is the difference of knowledge and truth, and is the movement in which that difference is canceled. So how do we go from one shape of consciousness to the other? Through a progression, through actually working through the difference between knowledge, and knowledge here could be action, by the way, or could be desires, or could be willing. It's being used in a very broad sense. And then truth. These are worked through. There's a cancellation, an Aufhebung of their difference, their distinction, their Unterschied. They're being separated apart from each other. And we get to a resolution, and then we move into the next shape of consciousness, the next section of the phenomenology. So just to take some examples, right? Think way back to the consciousness section, which had three main subsections. Sense certainty. We begin with what Hegel says, listen, this is a great starting point. We begin with objects that we encounter in space and time, and we're not even thinking in space and time, although that's where we're encountering them. We're just thinking, wow, water, air, tree, and then we start getting a little bit more abstract with that. We start to realize that they are, in fact, connected with space and time now, here, and we realize that, this is not so immediate as we thought. The truth of these is not the same thing as our knowledge, our knowing of them. How are we going to bring these two back together? And then we get to the next stage, perception, the thing in its qualities. Right now we start to get to things that are a bit more complex, and we can think about, well, what is a quality? What is an actual substance or a thing? And we work through that. And once again, we see that the truth of it doesn't map neatly onto our knowledge of it. And in order to get that truth, we have to change our knowledge, right? And then we get to one of the hardest sections of the phenomenology, force and the understanding, because we're thinking about things no longer just as isolated individual things with their property, let alone like immediate experiences. We're thinking about them in relation to each other as governed by laws, moved by or expressive of forces, and we try to unify it as subjects with our own minds. We try to seek out that truth again, right? And it's the stuff that we go through with that, we wind up with worlds and all sorts of very interesting interactions, and eventually we get a sort of reconciliation. That's the way the phenomenology works, according to Hegel. Okay, so in the Phenomenology of Spirit, each movement is this difference, and the overcoming or cancellation of that. Science, he tells us, does not contain this difference and the canceling of it. Well, now that sounds like, science is missing something. Science isn't quite as good, isn't quite as robust, isn't quite as well worked out as the Phenomenology of Spirit. It's kind of, he'll use a word, abstract. And so maybe we're missing something as we transition to science. It's great to have science, but we got to leave all this stuff behind. Now, that's not really the case. Science does not contain this difference and canceling of it. Why? Because sense the moment has the form of the notion. Notice he's been using content here. Now he talks about form. It unites the objective form of truth and the knowing self in an immediate unity, right? Truth and the self, truth and the subject that is trying to attain that truth through knowledge have been brought together in science. Science still has a subject, but it's being presented in a, you could say, I don't want to say more objective because that's gegenständlich, a more developed, more individual, independent way, right? And here is where, once again, he brings up notions. And he says that the moment does not appear as this movement of passing back and forth from consciousness or picture thinking earlier into self-consciousness, and conversely. On the contrary, its pure shape, freed from its appearance and consciousness, the pure notion and its onward movement depends solely on its pure determinateness, right? So science is doing something different. It's not something independent of us, but you can think of it as a transformation and consolidation of our thinking that all of the previous work in the phenomenology has now prepared first Hegel for, and now us, his readers. This is the way Hegel would construe it, I think. Now, he goes on and he talks about each abstract moment of science. To each of these corresponds a shape of manifest showing itself, spirit as such. So what do we have here? A correspondence between the determinate notions that are what science is trying to provide us with, a correspondence to shapes of consciousness, shapes of, here he says, of spirit, spirit's shapes. So this is very interesting. Why does this correspondence matter? Because we want to get from the phenomenology of spirit ultimately into science, right? The phenomenology of spirit can't remain merely a phenomenology in the sense of like looking on to the process and saying, aha, here's what came after this, and this is why things develop this way with a certain necessity. Here's the complex arrangement. We have to however you want to translate it, supersede, cancel, transform, raise to a higher level, aufheben. We have to do that to ourselves and our own knowledge to transform it into science. So he goes on and he says, just as spirits in its existence is not richer than science, he doesn't actually say science there, he just has a pronoun referring to it, it's not poorer either in content. So spirit in its existence, not richer than science. That's good news for science, isn't it? Right? Because spirit in its existence is about as rich as you can get. It encompasses everything in the world. So what does that mean? Science, Wissenschaft, should have all of that content as well, right? It should be able to extend to everything. Take it all in. Now, of course, the way it presents it is not just a big mass of like everything scribbled down in journal after journal. It's got to be organized. It's got to be thought through. It's got to be aufgehoben. The essential moments of it have to be pulled out, and the other stuff has to be left behind. But he goes on and he says, to know the pure notions of science, once again, determinate notions, pure notions, what it is that science is articulating itself through. To know the pure notions of science in this form of shapes of consciousness constitutes the side of their reality. And here he uses Realität, not Wirklichkeit, which is kind of interesting. So he's not talking about the transition into like real life or something like that. He's talking about how they present themselves to us in ways that we kind of can't get away from, right? And that is in the Phenomenology of Spirit. And he says, in accordance with their essence, the Wesen, the notion, the Begriff, which is posited in them in its simple mediation as thinking, denken, breaks asunder the moments of this mediation and exhibits itself in accordance with the inner antithesis, the inner Gegensatz. We're not fully done here because there is a contradiction. There is a Gegensatz that now gets revealed. But we're really, really close. I think you can sense it. You might even be able to, as we say metaphorically, smell it, sniff the path ahead and be like, we are getting to the end of this entire process. And indeed, we only have 3 more paragraphs to go at this point. So, a lot has been accomplished, not only up to this point, but especially in this very interesting paragraph.